Dear audience, it is great joy that we welcome you today to the final Zoom na Cartografia session of the 2024 academic year in the Southern Hemisphere. And what a way to conclude the year by hosting the two founders of this remarkable research program, Guglielmo Cinque and Luigi Rizzi. However, I will leave their introductions to my colleague Achilles. Allow me to take this brief introductory moment to reflect on our Zoom na Cartografia project. It began during the pandemic in 2021. Our two research groups, La Casa at University of Unicamp and NEG at Federal University of Santa Catarina, came together with the shared initiative of creating a space for online academic exchange and debate, broadcast via our YouTube channels. This marked the birth of Zoom na Cartografia. Today, as we celebrate 3.5 years of this project, it is an immense honor to, for the first time, welcome two very special guests, Professors Luigi Rizzi and Guglielmo Cinque. Thank you. But I will now hand over to my colleague, Professor Aquiles Tescari Neto, from La Casa at Unicamp, who will moderate their introduction. Before anything else, I would like to wish you all an inspiring Zoom session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. Dear audience, I'm absolutely delighted about today's Zoom session. After 3 years and a half of broadcasting on the NEG from the Federal University of Santa Catarina and La Casa from Unicamp channels at YouTube, as Professor Sandra Quaresemi already explained, we are introducing an exciting new format, the Roundtable. This edition promises to greatly enrich our original format of lectures, which we will still occasionally feature. What better way to launch this roundtable format than by welcoming the two founders of this line of research within the Principles and Parameters framework, the cartographic program, Professors Luigi Rizzi from the Collège de France and Guglielmo Cinque from Foscari University of Venice. Today's roundtable, the first in our Zona Cartografia series of conferences titled Almost 30 Years of the Cartography of Syntactic Structures. Our two distinguished scholars need no introduction. They are renowned figures in the field. Each of them we will have 25 to 30 minutes for their presentation, followed by a discussion. Here are the titles of their talks. Professor Luigi Rizzi, Description and Explanation in Syntactic Cartography, Issues and Prospects, and Professor Guglielmo Cinque, Cartography, Things that Remain to be Done. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to share them directly in the YouTube chat or send them via email. We are going to put the email on the YouTube chat. We've agreed that Professor Luigi will start us off. The floor is yours, Luigi. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, Achilles. Let me first wholeheartedly thank you and Sandra Quaresimi for organizing this exciting occasion for discussion about the past, the present, and hopefully about possible ideas for the future. So I discussed a little bit with Guglielmo how we would share this very nice cake that you offer to us. And so we thought that we would start with some comments on the origins of cartographic projects, say something about the goals, illustrate how we go about describing and explaining properties in cartographic projects, and then conclude with some remarks on the issue of language acquisition. How are the complex structures brought to light by cartographic studies acquired by the child? And then I'll leave the floor to Guglielmo, who will discuss some various outstanding problems and some possible directions for future research within the cartographic ideas. Now, starting from the origins, there are, of course, many ways of addressing the issue. One possible starting point could be taken to be Chomsky's influential idea that functional elements project X-bar schemata, so that the head of the clause is an inflectional node, which was originally conceived of as a conglomerate of properties, a conglomerate of features. A couple of years later, Jean-Yves Pollock made the also extremely influential proposal that perhaps it was advantageous to split the components of info and have more natural and more elementary components defining the inflectional field of the clause, and that by doing this move, doing this splitting operation, one would gain much insight on properties like distribution of verbs with respect to different adverbial positions. And at the same time, there could be a way of capturing in a principled manner certain properties of the inflectional system, of the verbal inflection in French. Then, shortly after, Adriana Belletti asked what would then become a typically cartographic question. They should say, what is the right order of the two components that Pollock had identified? And her proposal was, as indicated in the slide, that agreement is in fact higher than tense, and that by making that sort of proposal, one could immediately capture certain properties like the order of morpheme in Romance by using Mark Baker's mirror principle, essentially. And then again, shortly after Belletti's proposal, Chomsky went back to the issue and in a paper in the early 90s suggested that perhaps both Pollock and Belletti were right in a certain sense. That is to say, more than a single agreement position should be postulated per clause, and perhaps there would be a position of agreement higher than tense, as in Belletti's proposal, and one lower than tense, as in Pollock's original proposal. And there was much to be gained by this kind of assumption. Then it was not really, this line was not explored at the beginning, but one could, in retrospect, observe that many languages make Chomsky structure immediately visible. For instance, if you study Bantu languages, you have representations like two with agreements with subject and object that surround the tense position, as it were. Then, for few years, this splitting approach was pursued, and it was immediately obvious that by using this logic, one could not just stop this first step, right? For instance, if you take French paradigms 1 through 5 and add other adverbial positions, it's clear that you cannot just get away with two functional positions. You need more, because if you take a third adverb, you'll need an additional position that can be occupied by the verb. A fourth adverb will illustrate the necessity of an additional position, and so on and so forth. We suggested that perhaps what Pollock called T should be further split into other things like tense, aspect, mood, voice, and other properties. More or less at the same time and in parallel, Urszlonsky came up with the proposal that maybe also the Agra node should be split into finer components, because one could take the 5 features defining agreement, person, number, and gender, and assume that each of them would determine its own projection. And again, there was much to gain by doing that sort of hypothesis. So there was a lot of excitement for several years. People kept splitting categories. And of course, this raised the question, where will it stop, right? So when will we know that we have reached some kind of bedrock and we have reached the level of the atoms of syntactic computations? Then at that point, in discussions with Guglielmo in the early 1990s, we had the idea that perhaps one could take the problem upside down and take it from the opposite end, as it were. That is to say, rather than continuing to split heads on the basis of empirical evidence, we could ask the question, what is the maximal expansion of each zone of the tree? The idea was that this would put an upper bound to the complexity of each zone, right? And so we started asking questions like, what is the maximal set of properties that each zone of the tree expresses? Does each property correspond to a syntactic feature defining a head? One methodological guideline, which was extremely influential at the beginning and then continues to be extremely influential, is the one indicated in 1. So the idea is that one interpretable syntactic feature, that is to say, a feature visible to both syntax and semantics, defines one lexical item, particularly an item of the functional lexicon, but maybe an item of the lexicon in general, and this defines one head when the element is introduced in syntax through merge. Now, I consider this a guideline. Kane gave it a name, called it principle of decompositionality. I continue to consider it a guideline because it's, in a sense, there's still something that is still missing, which is a general theory of the set of features that may play this kind of role, right? So what we still need, I'll go back to that in the conclusion, is something like a Mendeleev table of the syntactic atoms, of the elements that can count as syntactic atoms. So I still consider it a guideline. Nevertheless, it's sufficiently clear in a number of straightforward cases to have obvious effects. And the obvious effect is that it determines the fact that syntactic representations are locally very simple. That is to say, the lexicon cannot form complex conglomerates of features. For instance, we cannot have in the lexicon a verb inflected for mood, tense, aspect, and so on, right? Or a complementizer expressing force, topicality, focus, etc., etc. So conglomerates are banned from the lexicon, but they can be created by syntax. So syntax can put things together and create complex entity, which will then be expressed as, for instance, inflected verbs or complex complementizer systems. Now, this idea clearly has an antecedent in the lexical decomposition ideas proposed in generative semantics. For instance, in the 1960s, there was a very influential paper by James Macaulay about lexical decomposition, about the fact that there could be certain transformations that would apply before lexicalization. For instance, could the verb kill be decomposed as cause to die? This is clearly similar in many respects to current discussions about the structure of the little v system as in much cartographic work, like the references that I've mentioned here. So if on the one hand, at the local level, things are extremely simple, the price to pay for that is that global representations are very complicated because there are many properties to express, so we need many features, so that the set of properties must be scattered in representations. That's why cartographic representations are as complicated as they look. And this is a simple consequence of the assumption of this very general guideline. Now, one of the goals of cartographic studies, there are two connected goals for description and explanation. I will go back to that in a moment. So let me start here from the third goal, which was to enlarge the core of syntactic theory by integrating neglected areas like adverbial positions, which were neglected at that time and have become center stage, moved to center stage in the work. And similarly for adjectival positions in nominal structures, and Guglielmo's contributions have been decisive, of course, on these questions. The second or fourth goal is to interact with the study of the syntax morphology interface with special reference to programs of syntacticization of morphology. So the program really started with Chomsky's syntactic structure and then pursued by lines of research like nanosyntax or Kane and Collins morphology as syntax. In fact, antecedents of these ideas are very old. I found in Ferdinand de Saussure, for instance, this kind of approach where Saussure wants to give examples of phrases, syntagme in his French terminology. He illustrates examples like contre tous, against all, which is something you would call a phrase, but also magnanimous. That is to say, a complex word for him is a phrase, which of course is very similar to current ideas that are explored in the approaches that I've just mentioned. Then fifth point, to integrate in the structure of the clause certain articulations linked to the organization of discourse, topic, comment, focus, presupposition, so on and so forth, which are geometrically assimilated under the criterial approach to the relation between an operator and its scope domain, as specifier have complement configurations. So the idea here is to connect syntax, again, establish a bridge with something else, which is the theory of discourse, the theory of informational structure. And then sixth point, which is in fact a very large point, is to interact with various domains of the study of language as a cognitive capacity. First, language acquisition, and we'll say something about the acquisition of cartographic structures. Second, language acquisition, language teaching, and here there's important work conducted by Achilles and his group in Campinas. Language pathologies, work by Naama Friedman and her group in Tel Aviv. Computational linguistics, Cristiano Casey, Giuseppe Samo, and his quantitative cartography, which is now a developing branch of computational linguistics. Okay, so let's go back to description and explanation. So one could characterize cartography as a vast descriptive endeavor, right? So we want to describe things. We want to offer detailed maps, detailed formal characterizations of the fine structure of phrases and clauses across languages and dialects. Now, description is very important and should not be downplayed for many obvious reasons. The first is that reliable descriptions are essential for theory, for theoretical research. There cannot be any good theory without very good descriptions. And of course, also in the other direction, there is a necessary link between the two aspects. There cannot be good description without a very strong theoretical guidelines, very strong theoretical background that would guide description. Otherwise, description will start in all imaginable directions. Then, so the two things really go together. And then all sorts of applications must be based on good language descriptions. Didactic applications, computational applications, for instance. Just think of the spectacular progress of the large language models. Such models require very detailed benchmarks in order to test the progress that is made in that extraordinarily successful domain nowadays. And of course, such benchmarks can only be offered if there are very precise formal description of the structure of languages. Similar for clinical applications, and then for the documentation and preservation of endangered languages, of course, good descriptions are absolutely essential. But the point is that only a minute fraction of languages of the world has been described in a systematic way. In a famous controversial article published a few years ago, Evans and Levinson estimated that about 10% of the world languages are described. Now, this is much too optimistic. If one looks at the level of detail that is required by generative analysis, clearly it's a much, much smaller fraction of the languages of the world. So that language description is a vast open territory for linguistic research, and in particular for cartographic research. This is something that we should talk with political authorities and academic authorities about, right? So it's something that justifies creating jobs in linguistics for the foreseeable future. And then as 70 years of generative grammar have developed extremely sophisticated tools for linguistic analysis, there's no reason not to exploit them fully for language description. We should not leave description of new languages undescribed or poorly described languages to other fields, to other approaches that are perhaps less well equipped than we are in to deal with such the problem of description. And then description goes hand in hand with explanation. In fact, the two things are two sides of the same coin. So it's very important to keep in mind that a good map, an empirically correct map, is the starting point of the explanatory process. It's not the end point. This particular point was misunderstood in some of the critical literature, but it should be clear that we are interested in description and explanation at the same time. Particularly, we want to understand how the generalizations that we observe in cartographic work, for instance, about the ordering of elements, can be traced back to plausible ingredients of the language faculty, understood in the broadest possible way. So it will include principles that are specific to language, principles that are of general cognition, principles that will concern the organization of complex systems in general. So we should define things in a very broad way, but we are really deeply interested in principled explanation. So as soon as we ask why questions of this sort, cartographic research becomes a generator of empirical problems for linguistic theory, right? So it creates new puzzles that theoretical reflection should address. And this is extremely important, I believe. A sign of the vitality of a field is its capacity to create new puzzles. And so cartography tries to give its contribution to this aspect. Okay, let me very quickly illustrate, taking a couple of examples from my work, how this interplay between description and explanation works. So let's consider two generalizations having to do with topic and focus in the left periphery of the clause. So one generalization is that many languages that admit multiple topics, not all languages, some languages like a single topic, but what is clear is that across languages, a single focus position is typically allowed. This is shown by a variety of examples. So here we have some Indo-European languages, Finno-Ugric, Semitic, Turkic languages, particularly simple to observe. This property is particularly simple to observe, unicity of the peripheral focus. If we look at languages that mark focus with a specific morphological marker, because in that case, it's sufficient to just count the focus markers and see that only one is allowed. So, for instance, in these languages, like the African language Gungbe, for instance, example 10, which was the first African language described and dealt with in full cartographic detail by Enoch Abo some 20 years ago, it's clear that only one focus marked element can occur in the left periphery of the structure. Similarly for the Bantu language Basa, similarly for the other languages that are illustrated here. So why is it that we have this uniqueness? One possible way to go, which in essence I already proposed in the 1997 paper, is that this may be related to certain properties of the interface characterization of focus presupposition configuration, in the sense that if we take the criteria view, a focal head, which will co-occur with a specifier and a complement as in 1, will determine the interpretive properties of the two elements. Now I'm assuming a theory of focus by which focus is intimately related to new information, as in the Halliday tradition, Lambrecht tradition, so on and so forth. So there's this connection. Then it's new information plus something else. So it could be correctiveness, mirrativity, or a few other properties, but fundamentally it expresses new information. Whereas the complement of the focal head expresses the presupposition, the shared knowledge between participants in the speech act. So this amounts to saying that if we had recursion of the focal head, we would have an interpretive conflict, because the specifier of the lower focal head, as in example 2, would at the same time be focus, hence express new information, and be part of the presupposition of the higher focal element. And there is a conflict between these two things, something that cannot work. For that reason, recursion of foci is not allowed, given this way of looking at things. Foscari, Neto, and Quaresemin have shown in a number of recent papers that then one should carefully distinguish this notion of focus from the notion of focalizing adverb, which work differently and that particularly can survive one in the scope domain of the other. Second generalization, if we if we look at the core topics, that is to say contrastive topics and aboutness shift topics in the terminology of Foscari and Hinterholz and Bianchi and Foscari, we observe that the topic position typically is higher than the focus position. If you look at other types of topics, like what they call familiarity topics, we see that their distribution is different. That's why in my original version of the left periphery, I had topic positions all over the places. But if we concentrate on core topics, topic positions are higher than focal positions. This is shown again by a number of languages having overt markers, so overt topic and focus markers, which clearly show that the only possible order is topic followed by a focus, essentially. So why is it so? There is a simple approach based on the interpretive properties of the topic comment structure. Again, a topic head will trigger interpretation of specifier and complement as topic and comment, respectively. Topic will be something salient somehow in previous discourse. Comment could be anything expressed by a clause, right? But with one restriction. So it's reasonable to assume that principle 2 holds. A comment must contain a focus position. It makes sense that the comment will have some new information. Otherwise, the comment would simply be redundant with respect to what is already is shared information in discourse. So a rational theory of discourse would reasonably include this kind of condition. Now, if this assumption is made, it immediately follows that the order will be topic focused, because if we have that order as in 4, the comment will include focus, of course. Whereas if we had the opposite order in the left periphery, we would have that the comment indicated in green in structure 3 not include focus, which would be external, and that would violate principle 2. So in this way, one can try to give an explanation, an account of the fact that we typically find that sort of ordering effect. Okay, so let me quickly conclude in the last few minutes. I think I have more or less another 5 minutes, perhaps, if I'm not mistaken, by saying something about acquisition of cartographic structures. How are they acquired? We can address this question in terms of learnability theory, the logical problem of language acquisition, and in terms of what actually happens in language acquisition. Now, as far as learnability theory is concerned, I don't see any problem with cartographic structures. The essential thing is that there would be certain principles involved of the kind that I've just discussed. There will be certain parameterizations. Parametric values will be accessible to the learner. So I don't see any particular problem from the point of the logical problem of language acquisition, even though there have been some debate on that in the literature. But let me focus on what actually happens in language acquisition. So in recent work, collaborative work with Naama Friedman and Adriana Belletti, we have tried to address this question, particularly in connection with the acquisition of the left periphery of the clause. So there's this paper quoted here, and we have tested essentially the acquisition of the left periphery in Hebrew, and now a lot of work has been triggered by this approach, checking these properties in other languages. In any event, just to stick to the original proposal, the idea was to identify some, say, a dozen of properties, some of which involve the lowest part of the tree, essentially the IP structure, like properties having to do with the ordering subject-predicate. Subject-predicate structures require the IP structure, which can be as complex as Guglielmo's IP, of course, but here it's simplified. Then we looked at other properties that necessarily involve the lower part of the left periphery, like WH questions, which typically target the focus projection, adverb preposing, which targets a specialized position which can be in the low part of the structure of the clause, perhaps also yes-no questions. And then there are other A-bar constructions that involve the, or contractions quite simply, which involve the upper part of the left periphery, the force node, the int node that hosts elements like y, for instance, then the topic node. So all sorts of embeddings require this part of the structure, declaratives, interrogatives, relatives, why questions because of the special properties of why, topic structures. Okay, then we tested how in natural production the constructions involving these different zones of the tree are manifested in the course of acquisition. And then we were able to build what is called a Gatman scale. Here it's upside down with respect to what you may have seen in the original glossa paper. This will appear in
Luigi, can you hear me fine? I guess there is a problem with Luigi's connection. Luigi? Sandra? Can you hear me, Sandra? Yes? Yeah, I guess Luigi got frozen. Luigi got frozen in place. So there is a criteria freezing problem with Luigi's connection. But now he's back. So you can continue, Luigi.
Am I back? Am
Yeah.
I back? I am back. So now, yeah, how did you see this slide that's already? I mean, I started commenting this slide.
Yes.
Shall I continue on that? I'll continue on that. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is a Gatman scale upside down with respect to the the glossa paper that we published a few years ago. Each line here represents a child, what a child does. Each column represents a construction. And the blue squares or rectangles indicate that the child has produced that particular construction. Otherwise, the zero means that it's not there. Okay? So what we observe in this configuration is that some of the children. No, again, I'm frozen again. Am I frozen?
You are okay now. You are okay now.
I am okay. So I'm very close to concluding, so it shouldn't be too bad, even if I have to stop at this point. But I hope I'll be able to conclude. So some children do not have any of these constructions. Other children only have the construction.
I guess Luigi.
Involve no left periphery. Is it okay or
it is not that
okay? It's not that okay.
Now
okay.
It is okay, Luigi. You can keep.
Okay. Okay. So and then some children will have the structure of the IP and also the lower part of the left periphery. And other children will have all the three zones available, okay? So both the structure of the IP, the lower and the upper part of the left periphery. So older children will have the full grown structure of the clause, and previous group will involve only partial structures, development of only partial part of the tree structure. Let me conclude because I can see that there is something that is not going properly with my connection. And I just conclude with these open questions, and then that will be the natural way to leave the floor to Guglielmo. There are many, many open questions in this way of looking at things. I will just ask two questions, one involving the atoms and one involving the molecules of our representations, if you allow me to use this analogy with chemistry and physics. So what are the elements of cartographic representations? Can we build something like a Mendeleev table for the elements, for the atoms of syntactic representations? And what are the possible chunks? What are the possible molecular structure that we see in cartographic representations with potential implications for many, many things, phase theory, parametrization, and also language change, language loss, and so on and so forth. So one thing that we should do in the future is to focus on atomic and molecular structures of our cartographic representations. I will stop at this point. I have the impression that there have been some problem in the final part of the presentation. I hope that at least the beginning of the presentation was accessible. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Luigi. Thank you very much. Now you can stop sharing your screen, and Louis and Guglielmo can start sharing his.
Sure. Let me see. If it's
we are not seeing your.
Can you see
so
my?
We are seeing your
not?
personal email, Guglielmo. If you can stop sharing, please.
So let me do it again.
Yeah.
Okay, let me also thank you and Sandra for this special occasion that you organized. Now, Luigi has given a thorough overview of the important features and goals of cartographic work, with special reference actually to the roles of description and explanation. What I would like to do is to, at least for what I think might be directions worth of exploring more for the cartographic work, and some of the things that still remain to be solved and still remain open questions like Luigi had. In particular, I'll come back to his last point, which exactly recalled a discussion I had with Kane about atoms and molecules. It's very interesting. So let me start with these are the essential points I want to touch on, even if briefly: the basis of the functional sequence, the reconstruction of the universal hierarchies from the attested word order variation, how much of the hierarchy is present in a given sentence. That's an open question that I think also should be taken into account. And other things are the role of morphology, and especially for certain phrases that have not been thoroughly investigated. The extension to discourse, which also seems to have a kind of cartography outside of sentence grammar. And more tentatively, the size of the functional lexicon, which is a big problem. Let me start with let me take out this, with an elementary consideration. There is a narrow interpretation of cartography that even linguists that do not accept or adhere to cartographic work really are ready to accept. And one example is actually Williams' article entitled "There is no alternative to cartography" in a volume which was entitled "Alternatives to Cartography." For him,
He's frozen too.
there is no way out. Very worried about the connection between two two functional sequences, how they can combine. He also observed that this determination of the functional sequence opens up a big question of explaining the sequence, something that Luigi had already started discussing. And for him, two broad subtypes of explanation, interestingly, have been pursued for him, both of which aim at dispensing universal grammar from regulating the sequence, so to speak, or the lexicon from regulating. One first type is the intrinsic relation between the elements involved, which may determine their relative position. And he gave an example with negative polarity items. Another clear example, I think, of intrinsic ordering, in fact, a kind of virtual conceptual necessity, to use one of Chomsky's phrases, is the relative scope between epistemic modality and tense that I discussed some years ago. Now, if you take an ordinary finite sentence like John left, the speaker commits to the truth of the proposition. And only if he or she introduces some epistemic modality item like a modal like must, John must have left, or John probably left, then he suspends the commitment to the truth. So nobody, if John did not leave, nobody can say you were a liar because you said that he left. Now, the truth of a proposition can be ascertained only if a subject-predicate relation is anchored in present or past time. Non-finite sentences or future realis clauses are not susceptible of being true or false. So, for example, it makes no sense to ask whether the subject infinitival to leave, partire, is true or false. It's simply, it's not anchored in time. So, in other words, to suspend the truth of a proposition, there must be a proposition whose truth can be ascertained. And epistemic modality thus presupposes the existence of a tensed proposition to operate on. Whence, it's the fact that it composes above tense. It simply presupposes that. The second type of explanation, which according to Williams is generally pursued, consists in identifying, his words, a substructure of the functional sequence with elements of an ontology of some kind, consisting of events, facts, speech acts, etc. More recent terms with the conceptual intentional interface, which reflects, we might think, the cognitive ontology. And see in particular the discussion in Rizzi's article in 2013 and what he discussed today. Now, concerning the possible conceptual underpinning of this cognitive ontology, it's interesting to quote one paragraph of Chomsky's, who writes the following. Children acquire knowledge of lexical items on the basis of very few presentations, perhaps only one. Barring miracles, this means that the concepts must be essentially available prior to experience. Children must be basically acquiring labels for concepts they already have. And for example, we might come back to that, to the molecule. A clear case in point, I think, corroborating Chomsky's idea, I think, is given by the cross-linguistic expression of progressive aspect. Looking at how it is expressed in different languages, there are at least almost 30 different ways in which it can be expressed. And so it becomes clear that the child has simply to learn from context how this, I would say, precompiled concept of progressivity is encoded in his or her language. To give just a few cases that are found, language after language, you have locative preposition plus nominalized form of the verb, or a verb of standing or lying and so on, or to be in the middle of, to be near to be after, this is Venetian, to be in the course of, to be busy with, that's Afrikaans, to live, to hold, to have, to do in some dialects of English. It do rain, meaning it's raining. Tone marked progressive, reduplicated verbs, particles with no transparent meaning. So clearly, the child has to grasp from context whether the sentence is generic or progressive, and simply learn how his language or her language has recruited some morpheme or some periphrasis to express that. Now, this point concerning cognition actually needs to be qualified, I think, because the functional lexicon, which is part of UG, we might expect, is only a fragment of the concepts that populate our cognitive system. Especially in a more recent paper, I looked at the area of emotions, where only a tiny set of emotions seem to be encoded grammatically. So looking at the list given in an old book by Darwin, Emotions in Man and Animals, and in a more recent article by Ekman, one finds clearly commiseration or pity through commiserative morphosyntax, affection, endearment morphology, contempt, pejorative morphology, but apparently there is no grammatical encoding through an affix or a particle for emotions like love, hatred, jealousy, envy, joy, pride, shame, and you can add as many as you want. So commiseration, for example, is morphologically encoded through affixes and particles in Austronesian, some Indo-European, Papuan, Tai-Kadai, Uralic, and so on. And in other languages, it is expressed by often morphologically reduced. For example, in Paduan, what we say povero in Italian or in poor in English is rendered as poro, which can only have the commiseration, not the without money interpretation of povero. And this is merged apparently in a high position among the direct modification adjectives. Now, another point is the extension of functional structure, not only to the contentive lexicon, but apparently also to the theta-related items, because we know that they seem to enter a specific hierarchy of arguments and circumstantials. For example, in a number of papers dating back from the 70s to more recently, Blansit, Pearson, and Abels argue that bare indirect objects, namely not prepositional indirect object, have to be higher than direct objects. And this can be seen in the different linearization that they gather in pre-verbally. For example, in 1A, you have the order, and that's the only order that you find, of bare indirect object and direct object. But post-verbally, 1C and D, you find either the mirror image, 1C, with direct object closer and indirect object further away, or the direct order that was found pre-verbal in 1A after the verb in 1D. And the same is true, I mean, the same left-right symmetry is found with circumstantials, with time and place. For example, in German, if you pick the proform for time and place circumstantial, then you find, elements that resist focalization. So that if you have a time or place circumstantial, heavy one, you can play it around focalizing one or the other and change the position. But if you use a proform, then you are stuck with only one possibility, with time preceding place. This is true also in Bulgarian. What you don't find before the verb is the opposite, with place coming before time. But once again, after the verb, you either have the mirror image, verb, place, time, as in English or Norwegian, where again, if you pick proform that resist vocalization, then you have only one order. So you say he went there then, and you cannot say he went then there. And post-verbally, you also find the other order in other languages, although it's less common. Now, from these cases, we already have an idea of the importance of having a theory of linearization, which allows us to reconstruct the universal hierarchies from the attested word orders that we find. So the universal hierarchies have to be arrived at despite the enormous word order variation that we find in cross-linguistically. For example, I give another example here. The attested orders of quality, size, and color adjectives, when they are all on the same side of the noun, are those in 3, with the usual left-right asymmetry. So before the noun, apparently you only have one possibility, quality, size, color. And after the noun, you have even 5 different possibilities, which correspond, if we look at the column at the right side, of the different orders that we find after the noun with demonstrative numeral and adjective. So we have exactly the same pattern with looking just at the types of the classes, at the classes of adjectives. These orders, I think, can all be derived from the following hierarchy, with quality, size, and color above the noun, which is the order which is found linearly, that we saw the only order found linearly if they are one after the other. But they can be derived, all the other possibilities, through a restrictive set of movements with only the noun or a bigger constituent containing the noun that moves by itself or by the 2 possible types of piping. I suggested, I think it's an interesting way to go, namely the pictures of whom and the whose picture types. Now, a theory that restricts the possible movements that give rise to different word orders, this is not accepted by everybody, but prominently by Kane and by many people, and also in cartographic work. I think Luigi has also utilized movement to account for order, for the canonical order. Is crucial, I think, to the cartographic program, as it permits the reconstruction of the underlying universal hierarchies from the orders actually attested cross-linguistically. And here it's something that cartography and typology can work together, in a sense, to enlarge the descriptive side of the field. Now, another point which I'm still quite uncertain about is how much of the hierarchy that we come up with is present in a given sentence. So take, for example, the Italian sentence piove, it's raining. Now, we know a lot of things about its simple sentence because we know that it's declarative rather than interrogative or imperative. It reports direct evidence by the speaker, not reported by other people. There is epistemic commitment. It's realis, not irrealis. It's positive, not negative. It's present rather than past or future. It's imperfect rather than perfect. It's progressive rather than generic. So here it seems attractive to say that the corresponding functional projections are activated and are present even in a simple sentence like piove. But what about other causal functional projections like evaluative mood, necessity and possibility models, and then all the aspects, frequentative, habitual, terminative, etc. Or consider the sequence of direct modification adjectives in object nominals from Scott, from his article. So you have a long list of possibilities. And are they all present in a phrase like my car? Are these projections corresponding to the different classes of adjective present? Now, it could be that every projection is always present with its default or possibly underspecified value, even if it's not overtly filled. And this position I took in my 99 book. And this, I think, was also the position, maybe Luigi will comment on that, that he took in his 2009 article for the left periphery concerning the presence of a WH interrogative projection, even when no phrase filled that position, which allowed a very interesting unification of the two types of locality that were disjoint, but could be unified, intervention and phase impenetrability. Now, alternatively, one might think the relevant projections are picked from the functional lexicon only when needed, only when relevant. And it's not entirely clear, but I think it's still possible to retain one form, perhaps, of the former hypothesis, namely that every projection is always present if projections do not count as interveners when they are silent and underspecified or negatively marked for their value. So consider one possible case in point, namely Koster's observation concerning the intervention of adverbs. He pointed out that an adverb like hélas, unfortunately, is higher than an adverb like probably, and this is shown in 4a. So only one order is possible inside the middle field of the sentence. But when both are present, only the higher hélas, the evaluative kind of adverb, but not the epistemic adverb, can move to modifier P, presumably, in the left periphery. That's a standard case of intervention, it seems. This is shown, he showed that and I reported it in 5a and b. So hélas can move up to the first position in a V2 clause, but waarschijnlijk cannot, crossing over the higher hélas. But of course, we know that, and he also pointed out that if there is no hélas in the middle field, then waarschijnlijk can move to the modifier P. So, and there is no intervention. So we have to deal with the fact that if the projection of the evaluative adverb is there, it must be not counting for as an intervener somehow. And one possible way to be worked out is if it's with an underspecified value or a negatively specified value, so that it does not count as an intervener. But I leave this as an open question. It's much broader as a problem, and that has to be understood more properly, I think. Now, for other things, and I go quicker now, of course, there are phrases that still await bigger and more thorough investigation, like adjectival phrases. There is only few works by Corver and few others, but the internal structure of adverbial phrases or quantifier phrases. But even other functional sequences need to be further investigated. For example, in the IP internal sequence, there seem to be more projections than those that I documented with an order in my 99 book. There is apparently accidental aspect affixes in some languages, or excessive aspect suffixes, meaning too much, or advanced aspect, like in advance or prima in Italian, when you can, or even a secretive aspect suffix when you say something like secretly or stealthily in English. Now, again, here only a hint, morphology, again, especially for phrases that are not investigated in depth, like the adjectival phrase, may again give some interesting they can shed light on the internal cartography of the elements that enter the phrase. For example, from Bobadic's work, it seems that in a number of languages we observe that a superlative morpheme co-occurs with a comparative morpheme, something that is not possible in Italian or English. And in particular, he suggests that a representation of the superlative properly contains that of the comparative. So there is a scope relation between the two. And once again, looking at what he gave in his book, you have only one order of the superlative comparative before the adjective, and two orders after the adjective, the mirror image, 8D, or the same order after the adjective, but you don't find languages where the comparative precedes the superlative morpheme. So once again, this looks like the same pattern all over. Now, another point that I wanted to raise is the possible extension of cartographic work, although this requires going outside of sentence grammar, so to speak, in the distinction that Williams gave in his 77th article in Linguistic Inquiry about discourse grammar, because there are elements that seem to be located outside of the sentence. So, for example, take cases like S4 DP, a kind of hanging topic, but more complex, of the normal hanging topic, which receives the default case that the language gives. So in Italian it would be nominative, in Bulgarian it would be nominative, in English it would be accusative. So that depends on the language. But what seemed to put these elements together as opposed, let's say, to topicalization or critical dislocation is that they do not enter in a relation with an element inside the sentence of sentence grammar. So they are actually outside. Not even agreement spans over the cut between sentence grammar and discourse grammar. Now, in what we see in Bulgarian is that there is, even for this pre-sentence field, there is a very strict ordering, so that the S4DP comes necessarily before the nominative hanging topic, what in the old tradition was called nominativus pendens in Latin. So in 9a, you see a very reduplicative case of, so as for John, he, nominative, then him, nobody, not him, loves, where nego is actually the clitic left dislocated element resumed by the clitic go, but the two elements, kolko to doivan, as for John, and toi, he, nominative, cannot change position. So that's shown in 9b, so where if you try to put the hanging topic before the S4 DP topic. And of course, they cannot come, here I only give in 9c the case of toi, the nominative being after the clitic left dislocated element, which agrees in case with the clitic, and that's also impossible. So it looks as if there is some order also outside the sentence grammar in discourse grammar. And this is even more striking in Cartasso's work on the pre-Vorfeld, what he says, the pre-4-sp positioning of a number of elements in a V2 language like German. So you actually end up having the verb being in sixth position, so to speak, because, and here is one example that he gives with the subject-oriented particle, ach, then a vocative particle, then a speech-related adverbial, ganz ehrlich, honestly, then a vocative, my dear Evelyn, then a non-conditional, no matter what you think, and then a hanging topic. And then you have the normal V2 with presumably movement of should to force P or to focus P, according to what value the element in first position has, whether it's a topic or focus. And on the antisymmetric incorporation of Williams' discourse grammar with sentence grammar through a discourse head that takes force P as a complement and the preceding material in the discourse as its specifier, I refer to especially Giorgi 2015. Now, my last point is concerned the size of the functional lexicon and the possible decomposition of lexical items. Now, the functional lexicon probably is very large, bigger than we are used to think. In addition to the elements that were mentioned in Rizzi 97, Cinque, Kane, Cinque Rizzi, Rizzi and Cinque, many papers, it includes adverbs, adjectives, light verbs, and other functional elements. Now consider, for example, the adverb presto in Italian, which is not simply a contentive element, but it has an aspectual function, so to speak. And presto in Italian corresponds to two adverbs in English, soon and early. When it is found preverbally, it corresponds to preverbal soon. So if you say presto si dovrà alzare, that corresponds to soon he will have to wake up. Then I gave one example from an Oceanic language where you have a soon particle for the same. When it's postverbal, si dovrà alzare presto, then it corresponds to early. So it will have to wake up early. And here I also give another example from what they in this Cinque Campa they call early time aspect, namely an action performed early in the morning. Now, the two can even co-occur because actually presto here corresponds to what we saw, two separate projections which hosted soon and early. So presto si dovrà alzare presto, molto presto. And it seems that, it seems that the two soon and early adverbs share something, have something in common, which may account for the strange possibility of one language like Italian of expressing the two with just one morpheme, with just one item. So both seem to have as a common core before the average time of something happening, a larger thing. And early is before the average time of doing something with some restrictions, maybe waking up or leaving or arriving, which are all activity kind of verbs. And one can say maybe Italian capitalizes on the common property before the average time of X, and thus uses the same morpheme, and English capitalizes on the different properties of something happening or of doing something, so employing two distinct morphemes. Now, the Italian case is a case of the more general phenomenon of underspecification, which needs to be further investigated, I think, whereby a morpheme is not specified in certain languages for certain features. And this has some relation to Keynes' idea of maybe having some silent elements, although, as probably we'll discuss later with molecules and atoms, this is not the whole story. And it's also an example of the possibility of decomposing the meaning of a lexical items into smaller atoms. How, without arriving at the quarks, but just remaining at the atoms is already, I think, enough. So I'll stop here, and we saw, an overview of some of the points that remain to investigate more deeply, and the existence of which I think is a sign of the vitality of the cartographic program, because it really shows the expansion which has shown its relevance in acquisition, and Achilles and Sandra even in teaching. And so it really covers a number of neighboring fields that it can shed light to, I think. So I'll stop here, and we'll be discussing with Luigi maybe something. Okay. So I interrupt condivisione.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Guglielmo. Thank you, Professor Luigi. I am sure the audience on YouTube truly appreciates your lecture. If you have questions, please type them on the YouTube chat or send an email to zoonacartografia@gmail.com. Now, while we are still waiting for questions from the audience, I will let you two ask questions, please. So feel free to address any topic on the other presentation. Thank you.
Okay.
Shall I start? Okay, so I hope the connection continues to work, because Memo got frozen a couple of times from my perspective. Maybe not for everybody. So in any event, I think virtually each slide of your presentation, would require, and I could give rise to very interesting discussion. So let me just mention 2 or 3 points. Maybe I'll start with one, and then you ask a question if you want to respond. So the first point is about the mechanism that you assume for this very important work that you have done over the years, starting with Greenberg's Universal 20, and then extending it to all sorts of properties of functional structures. We saw today with comparative and superlative, with the order of arguments, or so on and so forth. We typically observe that some orders are possible, some are frequent, some are rare, and some seem to be impossible. So there are certain gaps, and as usually, our attention is caught by the gaps, right? Appreciative distribution of the possible cases may be worth thinking about. In any event, the principle that clearly has a lot of explanatory value in the system you propose is that the engine of movement is the lexical projection. So the lexical projection, the noun phrase, the noun, let's say, or verb, or noun phrase, verb phrase, is what can reorder things. Within the functional system, as such, you don't really get to reorder, but only when the lexical element moves, and then it can carry some stuff to change the order through one of the possible piping systems, and so on. So, and then and that works beautifully. It's amazing how well it works to exclude certain things that otherwise could. The question is the only possibility. In the past, we discussed various possibilities. We thought about selection, for instance, that the noun could move within the noun phrase in order to get closer to higher selectors, for instance. Now, I was just thinking during your presentation of one possibility, and I'd like to know what you think about it, that perhaps is similar to the selection idea, but that has to do with Grimshaw's notion of extended projection, right? So it seems to be that by and large, within the extended projection of a certain type of lexical element, you can have these movements. So it could be that some identical lexical element should be licensed by that lexical element. In other words, it cannot just subsist as such. So presumably, it must enter into agreement relations with the lexical element. And then once an agreement relation is established, given the way in which we think of internal merge, just as a byproduct of that, decide to just leave things in place, other languages may decide to apply internal merge. At any event, that would be a way of licensing the hierarchy that goes with a particular lexical element. One needs that sort of thing because clearly you want to have a kind of address for each functional element, right? You want to know when you are merging one functional element what spine you are in, right? For instance, an agreement could be part of a nominal spine, of a verbal spine, and so on. But this element must be known by the functional element because the continuation of merge will depend on the particular kind of spine which the element is part of, right? So it could be that there is this notion of extended projection that amounts to the licensing of a functional structure, and this lies just as a byproduct, just as the way, which opens the question, what is the typology of movement? Is that just simple kind of movement or some special kind of movement? Okay, so this, I mean, it's a very complicated issue. I don't know if you have any immediate reaction to
Yes, no, I agree that something like that we have discussed previously, some variant of this idea. It needs to be relativized to a certain extent, I think, because it's absolutely true that the noun or noun phrase, the verb or verb phrase, or the adjective phrase action. The complicating things is that within the projections, there are other heads. So, for example, that end up on one side like number, determiner, and case. So, but it's still the case that the noun may incorporate this in raising up. So it either remains low and leaves the smaller heads to move. Depending on the kind of language that you have a number of possibilities. But I think, interestingly, the combination can be really narrowed down if one allows only movement of each head of each sub-projection, like the number projection, the DP projection, and so on, which contains, let's say, macro, sub-macro projection itself. So this is a good point to raise because it really is one very fruitful area to look into in the sense of what kind of orders one finds and how to avoid generating orders that are never found. And it also look into your idea of maximalization to try to understand why, for some reason, piping seems to be more unmarked than moving just the noun or just the verb. If you think of, fewer languages have the order with the Greenberg universal, like noun, demonstrative, numeral, adjective, or in the verb, in the clause, V2 languages, where you move just the verb, crossing over everything without altering the order, don't seem to be very frequent somehow. So there is something that has to be accounted for, which is not easy to why should piping? And I would also generalize internal movement in all cases, even where you seem not to have any movement. In the case of a demonstrative, numeral, adjective, noun, I would say that the noun still moves with the other piping, the pictures of whom, so that it generalizes to your idea that actually the noun has to raise up to the top, to the root of the projection. And with the aim of maybe licensing, selecting or licensing each nominal modifier, so to speak, or something like that. This is a very important point and needs to be further narrowed down in its consequences, I think. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
If I may add one comment on this, yes, the fact that piping, at least for that kind of movement, seems to be the largely preferred option, may be a matter of maximality, because when you move something to a specifier of some category, you create an XP-YP configuration in terms of the labeling algorithm, so that typically what will be the maximal projection once you have labeled the whole structure would be something with properties that are shared by the XP and YP that you have put together, so that the normal case would be to take the whole configuration you have created and move it further. But this opens an interesting question that is implicit or also in some cases completely explicit in your work. That is to say that certain configurations, if you look at the hundreds, in fact thousands of languages that you look at, over 2,000 languages in your database, you see that there are certain things that are common, some a little bit less common, and then there are certain things that are quite rare or even very rare, like the movement of this kind without piping, right? That's a rare option. So that raises the question: can linguistic theory have something to say about this quantitative dimension, which is very important and very clear? So one possible way to go would be the traditional way of saying, well, grammar only deals with yes/no issues, right? Either something is possible or not possible, and then if something is possible but rare, this will depend on some other factor. But I think it's not a very satisfactory viewpoint, even though it may be necessary. It would be much more interesting if we found ways to use grammar to account for the quantitative dimension as well. And this, I think, inevitably leads to some kind of theory of markedness, which tells us that there are certain choices that are marked, so they may be made, they are consistent with the general principles of universal grammar, but at some cost, which is in general avoided. And so this reopens the traditional issue of the theory of markedness. It would be interesting to ask the question of markedness from the viewpoint of the rich representations that we assume in cartographic work, because maybe there is a simple structural way of understanding markedness. I mean, a marked structure is something which you add some kind of specification, and the unmarked structure is one without a certain kind of specification. It's an idea that is not easy to make work, but I think it's, I mean, the possibility of introducing a quantitative dimension, I think, is a very attractive possibility, given the kind of work that you do. Yeah.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I had actually tried precisely in this way to find a structural basis of the descriptive fact that something is rarer than something else. Because as you say, you could sort of leave it outside of the realm of UG or something, but it would be nice if we could connect it to, and I had tried to relate it to the kind of movements, although it remains still to understand why just moving the noun or the verb alone somehow is more marked. That remains to be understood. But at least the two types of pied piping seem to show that one of the two which actually gives rise to the mirror image typical is the absolutely more frequent type, so that the whose picture type of pied piping somehow seems to be involved in the more frequent word orders and the pictures of whom. And we know independently that the two pied pipings differ in markedness if we look at WH movement, because in interrogatives you cannot have pictures of whom easily in root clauses, and absolutely impossible in embedded clauses. You can only have whose pictures have you seen, not pictures of whom. So I tried to see if one could exploit this markedness, independent markedness, exactly to go in the direction of pulling inside of the account also the frequency of the languages. Yeah, absolutely. And if I may, I don't know how much, maybe this will be the last question. We can go on talking about together afterwards. But I wanted, right. I wanted to pick up your last point left open, because I mean the distinction of atoms and molecules. This is exactly the metaphor that I used with Rizzi in one discussion, because there is a tension between, that has to be understood better, I think, between his idea, which is certainly most productive and important, of the presence of silent elements, and the fact that we have some concepts that are analyzed as a whole, so to speak, as a bigger entity, let's say a molecule, although also molecule can be decomposed, but let's say something that, because his idea was, for example, and in certain cases it works, to decompose, for example, a modal like need. He would say, you don't need to have a complex modal. You need to have a noun that incorporates into a light verb and gives you need as a modal. And so you have a silent element together with an actual pronounced element. However, it seems to be that alongside this possibility, which would account for the complex specifier in which the modal is found, where you find this, that there might be entities that are not unanalyzable, but at least come in as complex. One case is precisely the progressive aspect. Because if you look at the periphrasis or the way it's expressed, sometimes languages recruit elements that evoke parts of the meaning of progressivity, which is, by semanticists is given as a very simply, it's an activity which takes place in a point or an interval, which is within a larger interval, which has no beginning boundness and no final boundness. It goes on without interruption. And so you have in the middle. In the middle comes close to this idea that semantics gave. But then you have something like have or do or hold, which have no apparent. So it looks as if there is some ontology that comes with these aspects, presumably, at least with some of these aspects, which are analyzed. Even a dog maybe has not progressive, but prospective. Perspective would be, is about to live. And they know, I have a little dog, and it's clear that he has this conception of to be about to do something because he starts moving. So we have inherited maybe, from animals even, some of these complex concepts. I mean, this is very speculative. I'm not saying anything, but it seems to me that this is another area that needs to be looked into to see whether it should be analyzed as a molecule type or if it can be decomposed into smaller atoms. And that remains a kind of empirical question. So exactly as you had the idea of distinguishing these two possible ways that remain open, I think it's absolutely something to look into. So, well,
let me just react in 2 seconds, because probably we have already taken too much time. On the one hand, the idea of starting with already complex entities in a sense raises the question of how are they formed? How are they formed? Because they must be put together somehow, right? So how does that work? Presumably it's through merge. I mean, if we believe that merge is really at the basis of everything, there will be some kind of application of merge which will already create these complex entities that you and Rizzi have referred to. So I don't think we really want to assume precompiled things, complex things that are completely precompiled, because then that would again raise the question of how, when, were they precompiled, and where are they stored, right? So that this question will arise. And then the second thing that connects to your discussion of spectral properties is that clearly some kind of interaction, deep interaction, must be assumed between language as the symbolic system that we know and the language of thought. So all the properties that you are mentioning and that your dog presumably is able to figure out about temporal and spectral projections, this is exactly the domain that is studied when we talk about the language of thought. And the language of thought clearly has a computational nature, right? So it's much harder to identify atoms and molecules of the language of thought, of course. I mean, it's not so clear how to do that except going through language, at least for our species. But it's clear that there must be a language of thought that is in part language independent, and that it interacts in a very deep way with language as a symbolic system for giving shape to thoughts and for communicating in the way in which we understand language. So this is the very big issue that underlies.
Actually, I did not mean that the precompiled thing would be unanalyzable in the sense that even molecules are made of atoms, but then they may have a life of their own. Once they are put together, they function. They have a special function somewhere, and I think we should look into the workings of elements at different levels of complexity in biological world or something where they are put together, but once they are put together, they function as a unit, maybe. This is what, because that remains a very speculative thing, but I think it's the progressive thing, it seems to show that once you put together these elements that somehow the semanticists have discussed, then it acquires some kind of that is given for granted, although one can go into, I don't know, that remains a very big question, and we'll come back to that in another life.
Okay.
Right. Yes. So we should wait for their questions now, maybe. Okay.
Thank you, Guglielmo. Thank you, Luigi. Your discussion is truly inspiring, and we received many, many, many questions by email, and also people who are here following on the chat, they put some questions, and I am going to read out a few of them now. I am also pasting them for you on the Zoom chat, okay? The first question is by Fábio Bonfim from the Federal University of Minas Gerais. He's a professor there. And he's asking Professor Luigi Rizzi the following question. Some Bantu languages place focus constituents in a lower position, usually between TP and VP, what is called by the Bantuists as an IAV position, whereas Romance languages place it in the CP domain, in the left periphery of the sentence above the FINP. So, Professor Rizzi, I would like to know if we can explain this syntactic difference in terms of parametrical setting. In sum, the big question is, why do the Bantu languages move the focus constituents only to a lower focus position, whereas the Romance language move it to a higher position in the left periphery? Will it be the case that universal grammar may allow two focus positions, one in the CP domain and another in the lower info domain?
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Very clear question. Just a second. Okay. So let me say that it's not just the Bantu languages that use the low focus position. In fact, Adriana Belletti's work showed already many years ago that also for the Romance languages, for Italian in particular, you have to assume that not only the IP structure, but also the small VP structure has its own periphery with a focus position, a topic position, with certain properties that are slightly different from the left peripheral positions interpretively, but both types of positions are possible. And certainly there is an issue of parametrization because, for instance, if you compare standard Italian and certain Italian dialects, you see that the use of these two focus positions is not quite the same. Pure new information focus is expressed in Italian through the low focus position. So you cannot move something to the left periphery if it's just new information focus, the answer to a WH question, for instance. Whereas in certain Italian dialects, Sicilian, Sardinian, as analyzed by Silvio Cruschina, for instance, this variety, this dialectal variety, uses the high position also to express new information focus fundamentally. So some parametrization is needed. I think that the question really aims at the fact that two distinct focus positions must be assumed, and how is that consistent with the uniqueness of focus that I mentioned? Well, the fact is that in individual examples, only one of them can be activated. So you cannot activate them both. In certain structures, you can activate one. In other structures, you activate the higher one, but you cannot have both activated at the same time, because that would lead to the kind of problem that I illustrated. not with two focus positions in the left periphery, but with one in the high and one in the low periphery. It will be exactly the same state of affair, the kind of interpretive difficulty would arise. Okay, so I think it's a complex issue and there's much more to say, but I think I'll stop at this point.
Okay, thank you, Luigi. We have received a question by email from Adriana Belletti. Thank you, Adriana, for being here with us. And also a comment which is related to the question by Adriana Belletti by Charlotte Galvez. Thank you, Charlotte. So I am reading first Belletti's question, then the comment by Charlotte Galvez. It is already on the chat for you, Luigi and Guglielmo, to follow. So, the case of presto, mentioned by Cinque, recalls the one of adjectives like vecchio, different meaning prenominal versus postnominal position. The question becomes, but why the same word? Maybe the internal structure of the word allows it to fill different functional positions in the different extended projections, so the internal structure, nature of the same functional word, adverb or adjective should also be considered in a sort of nano perspective. And thank you, Adriana, for being here with us. And there's also a very interesting comment by Charlotte Galvez. Thank you, Charlotte, here from the University of Campinas. It's interesting to note that in French, there is tôt early and bientôt soon. Thank you, Luigi. Thank you, Guglielmo. It's always inspiring to hear you. Thank you.
Okay. Can I say something then, Luigi? May I add? Yes, absolutely. This is a very pervasive kind of situation where you find one language that uses one element where another language uses two different elements for what the other languages has just one. And this, I think, as I said, to show that the two projections, and you can see that they are often very different projections because they have a different merge position. So even vecchio as long-standing necessarily is pre-nominal as opposed to vecchio old, aged, which is typically post-nominal, although there are usages also pre-nominal, but it's lower than the other. So somehow they must share. In English, it's the same. Old can be used in both usages. An old friend or an old grandfather, where it's not a long-standing grandfather, but an aged grandfather. And in Bulgarian, they are two distinct kind of words, once again. So old can cover even other slightly different meanings. So for example, you can say, this is my old telephone number, which means no longer active, no longer, again, it must share something, or my old address. This kind of meaning must share something with old aged and also with long-standing. This remains, but these are cases which can help exactly to discover the atoms, in the sense that they allow you to see if it's very difficult to be able to reach exactly the way that the common parts and the differential parts. But certainly this is one way that would seem to help exactly the decomposition, as was discussed by Luigi and I also discussed.
Okay, let me just add add that this issue is really pervasive in the functional lexicon. That is to say, we typically see that the same form is used in ways that are obviously different and distributionally different, functionally different, I mean, from every viewpoint. But at the same time, it's reasonable to at least start from the hypothesis that it's not just accidental homonymy, that the two elements have something in common. Now, in the case of Presto, it's relatively straightforward. Then you look at the next languages, for instance, as Charlotte says, you see that in another language, you compose the piece with some other piece, and that gives a larger unit, and that helps, of course, understanding what happens in a language like Italian. But this is really pervasive. Just think, for instance, of the multiple uses of the element corresponding to K in Romance, that, right? So that can be used for declaratives, that can be used for relatives, that can be used for focalization in clefs and in other domains. So there is a multiplicity of use which had been used in the critical literature to say that it's not possible to give transitivity arguments of the type A precedes B, B precedes C, and then A precedes C. But in fact, the argument doesn't really hold. One should simply observe that these elements, as Memo just said, can occupy different positions. Now, do we want to say that the different K, for instance, are exactly the same element? I don't think that's possible. I think there are too many differences. Do we want to say that they are completely separate elements and they're only put together by diachronic considerations? Again, I don't think that is very satisfactory. So the only way that seems to reconcile the different aspects is to try to do what Memo did for Presto. That is to say, identify a common nucleus and then assume that there are other things that may be added so that K, for instance, can be used in Brazilian Portuguese to express declarative force, but also to express focalization, as in Carlos Miotto early analysis of the letter periphery that then Sandra developed in her thesis, and similarly for many other things. Take the fact that in Romance, S or C can be used for reflexive and can be used for impersonal and for a passive-like construction, right? Again, there seems to be something in common that should be expressed along the same lines, fundamentally. We just don't want to say that reflexive C and passive-like C are two completely different entities, nor that they are exactly the same entity, so that this indicates that a lot of work remains to be done on the structure of the functional lexicon to capture what there is in common and what the differences are. And comparative considerations are, of course, absolutely crucial in order to determine what the fine composition of these elements really is.
Okay. So you received many greetings from our audience. Christopher Lenslinger is sending greetings for both. Xavier Villalva, thanks to Professors Rizzi and Cinque for such great talks. Cartography explained by the founding fathers. Now, we have a question by Paul Roger Basson. Just a minute, I am typing this on the chat. The question is, to what extent can the cartography approach account for the ordering of noun modifiers in languages? For instance, Bantu languages, which allow free ordering of modifiers. Yeah.
This is for Memo.
Well, I don't know if it depends. One should look into the actual cases and see how free this free ordering is. Because there are languages in which, I mean, what I had been assuming as a restriction, namely that you can move only the noun and or bigger constituents containing the noun from the external merge, so that adjectives would be, you know, higher than the noun, than numerals, and so on, prohibiting movement of the single modifiers. But this is not completely true. It's true for the canonical orders of the language. The question is, how do we establish which one of the different possibilities is the canonical one? There are cases where you can establish the existence of more than one canonical order. If you think of Italian or English, adjectives typically in Italian follow the noun, but there are adjectives that precede, and some have to precede. In English, typically they precede, but there are some adjectives that have to follow. So, for example, present, when it means in the location type of the people present, it cannot mean the present people. So the question, and there is a, I think in Chupam and Kitaraka, it has been claimed that you do find 10 different orders of modifiers of the noun. And I don't have any clue or intuition about or ways to establish exactly what the canonical order is. In some languages, it's very clear because there is no choice. And in others, for example, in Bangla, it's very clear that one order is canonical, where you have demonstrative, numeral, adjective, and noun, but you can also have other possibilities with the adjective being preceding everything. But people, I mean, native linguists say that that's a focalization. Now, focalization targets one of Rizzi's criterial position. And that's a completely different type of movement from the movements that give rise to word order, the canonical word order, so to speak. So the question now is, how can we establish a canonical or maybe two canonical orders in some phrases or in the clause? That's a difficult question. But I think we should not abandon the idea of trying to find tests to distinguish between what is marked in the sense of resorting to another type of movement, either topicalization or focalization or WH movement or whatever, and cases where out of the blue, you have, even in English, people have claimed that there is free ordering, because you can say a big brown dog, but you can also say a brown big dog. But then people also say that you cannot use a brown big dog out of the blue. So you cannot say, this afternoon I went out and bought a nice brown big dog. That requires contrast with another adjective that has been claimed, that has been pronounced before. Mm-hmm. So again, one should be careful about teasing apart the two types of movements that are involved. One's in the canonical, giving rise to the canonical order. So essentially, I cannot answer you because it's a difficult question. But I would not abandon the idea of, having, or rather, let me put it the other way around. I would not assume that there are languages that don't have a rigid canonical order. The question is how to arrive at that, through which ways to establish one or two, if there are two, whatever, depending on the modifiers. So I'm sure that I think that in Schupamen, the author said that some of these orders involved emphasis or focalization. The question is to understand through putting it into a context and seeing which kind of focalization is involved and things like that. That remains, you know, to be done language internally, especially by a native speaker who has some intuition about. But also tests should be, anyway, you understood. This is my answer, partly satisfactory or unsatisfactory answer.
May I add just a short comment? So, in a sense, the issue that Memo and Paul are discussing resembles discussions that took place a long time ago on the order of constituents in the clause in languages like German or Japanese, for instance, right? That were assumed at some point to be completely free word order languages, because in fact, each permutation of the SOV order was possible. But in fact, through careful testing, it turned out that there are very clear notions of unmarked order that can be established. And perhaps one could add that it was possible to identify things like Greenberg's Universal 20 in the nominal domain, whereas such generalizations are harder to find, not impossible, but harder to find in the causal domain, presumably precisely because there are fewer movements of the reordering type within the nominal domain, movements of the type that are sensitive to information structure fundamentally, so that the generalization emerges more clearly, because otherwise in the sentence you just have too many possibilities to be able to identify certain properties. You can do it, as Memo's discussion, for instance, of the or even of the ordering of arguments shows. You can do it, but it's much harder. So it's probably not accidental that Greenberg was able to find this striking generalization in the nominal system, but not so immediately in the causal system, because of the number of types of movement that are accessible in the causal system.
Thank you. Thank you. I think unfortunately we no longer have time. We received many questions by mail and on the YouTube chat. We are going to forward them to Professor Cinque and to Professor Rizzi. Thanks for mailing us. Sandra, would you like to say something so we can
Yes, of course. I would like to express my heartfelt thanks to you, Luigi and Guglielmo, for this enlightening Zoom session. You are an inspiration to all of us. È stato veramente un Zoom d'oro. Grazie di cuore, grazie.
Okay,
And thank you, Achilles and our students, for your help in organizing this Zoom session. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, and we thank you as well.
Thank you, Sandra. Have more meetings in this format. I will just ask you to stay in the room for a second so we can take a picture with our students. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.